Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because last night at my father's retirement party, one folder changed a lifetime of favoritism in a single minute, and even now, retelling it feels like peeling back a scar that never fully closed, but that needed to be exposed for everyone to finally understand what had been hiding beneath the surface for decades. The party itself was the kind of event families in our town had been holding for generations when a patriarch closed the book on his career, with rented tables, neighbors stopping by, and old employees lifting glasses to tell stories about the good years. And I did not walk into that room planning to set fire to anything. I walked in hoping to keep my head down, support my father, and maybe get through one more evening of watching my brother Evan receive every compliment, every nod, every reminder that he was the golden child, while I was expected to clap politely and disappear into the background. When my father tapped his glass and raised his voice, telling everyone that Evan had never once let him down, the room broke into laughter that carried the warm ring of shared pride, and yet for me, that sound landed like an old bruise being pressed again. I cannot claim surprise, because this pattern had been rehearsed for 40 years. Richard praising Evan, Evan grinning with that sense of entitlement that never had to prove itself, and me, Julia, silently swallowing the knowledge that I was the one who cleaned up messes no one else saw, the one who handled loose invoices, reconciled strange reimbursements, and made sure the details balanced even when they were inconvenient. But in that moment, something different rose up in me, not rage, not jealousy, but a stubborn refusal to let a lie harden into family scripture one more time. I walked forward with steady hands, and instead of clapping, I set a manila folder right next to the cake knife, my smile as polite as I could make it, and said, "Strange, because this came for your golden child yesterday." I did not need to raise my voice. The silence that followed did all the work. Inside that folder was a notice from the State Labor Office requesting contractor classification records tied to vendors Evan had brought in, plus copies of reimbursements that looked less like business expenses and more like personal golf weekends. And an email Evan had sent that read, "Fix the split, we can wash later," which, to anyone who works with numbers, is exactly the kind of phrase that freezes your stomach. I had not stolen these papers or gone hunting through drawers like some petty spy. They had landed on my desk during a reconciliation project when the accounting firm fell behind. And something about them itched at me in the way numbers do when they are being twisted just enough to pass casual eyes, but not enough to survive daylight. I could see Evan's smirk form before he even opened his mouth, and sure enough, he laughed it off in front of the crowd, telling people audits happen all the time, that this was jealousy wrapped in paperwork, that nothing serious would come of it. My father tried to slide the evening back toward the slideshow of old shop photos, acting like if he smiled long enough, the folder might just evaporate. Guests shifted uneasily. Some stared at their plates, while others, people who had worked long enough to smell trouble, gave me quiet nods that said, "Finally, someone said it." I did not linger. I knew that if I stood there arguing, it would turn into another story about Julia being dramatic, Julia ruining a celebration, Julia not knowing her place. So I chose calm. I left the folder on the table, told my father he could ask me questions later if he wanted clarity, thanked the caterer as I walked out, and drove home with my stomach tied in knots, but my conscience finally unclogged of a silence I had carried for too long. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text that shifted everything from a personal drama into a workplace reality. Marisol Vega, the HR director, asked me to meet for coffee. She wrote only one sentence, "Thank you for not grandstanding, we need to talk." That line told me more than any speech could. Someone inside the walls had already been worrying, someone with authority saw what I had seen, and maybe, just maybe, I had not just thrown myself under the bus in front of relatives for nothing. That was the moment I realized the folder was not a weapon, it was a key. And once a key turns in a lock, doors do not politely close again, they swing open to rooms full of things no one wanted to acknowledge, and now it was too late for anyone, including my father, to pretend they had not seen what I placed in front of them. And so the question hung in the air, bigger than the toast, bigger than the slideshow, bigger than my family's habits. What exactly was the state looking for in that request, and how deep did the trail under Evan's so-called golden status really go? When Marisol and I sat down in that small coffee shop near the plant, the kind of place with chipped mugs and a constant hum of fluorescent lighting, I knew we were stepping into a different kind of conversation than anything I had ever had with my family. Because this was not about birthdays or old grudges anymore, but about the line where a company's survival collides with the way a father chooses to see his son, and that line, once crossed, could not be painted back over no matter how many stories Richard wanted to tell about loyalty or pride. Marisol slid the actual letter across the table, and even though I had seen a copy, something about the official seal and the direct wording, a request for information on 3 specific vendors Evan had personally pushed through without full review, sent a chill through me, because it meant the state was already aware that something smelled off, and once they ask, they rarely stop until every stone is turned over. I listened as Marisol explained what she had been trying to do quietly for months, documenting small anomalies, requesting routine conflict checks, and getting brushed aside with vague reassurances that everything was fine, that Evan had it under control, and that raising questions would only make her look disloyal to Richard in his final year at the helm, which, in a family business, might as well be the same as painting a target on your own back. I could hear in her voice the exhaustion of someone who had been labeled difficult simply for doing her job correctly, and it struck me that our experiences were running on parallel tracks, me, the daughter always told to step back, and her, the HR director always told to lower the temperature, both punished not for mistakes, but for insisting on basic accountability. We agreed almost instantly that we needed someone outside the family circle, someone immune to Richard's charm and Evan's bluster, which is why I called Priya, a forensic bookkeeper I had worked with once before when a small client nearly collapsed under the weight of a payroll audit. Priya was the opposite of dramatic. She believed in clean timelines, in mapping every dollar to a date and a signature. And she had no interest in family politics, only in whether numbers lined up in a way that could survive scrutiny. Within days, she requested the essentials: bank feed exports for 6 months, vendor onboarding checklists, and the merchant category codes tied to reimbursements, which may sound like mind-numbing details to most people, but in practice are the pressure points where fraud either collapses or escapes detection. It did not take long before Priya spotted 2 vendors with the same mailing address, a fact that could mean coincidence in theory but rarely does in practice, especially when further digging revealed that the landlord for both entities was an old holding company once tied to Harold Cole, Richard's late partner, whose name had not been spoken in our family for years, but whose fingerprints apparently still lived in property records. That discovery was like hearing an echo in an abandoned house, faint at first, but undeniable, and the more you listened, the more it told you there were still people moving in the shadows. Meanwhile, inside the company, Evan worked his usual strategy, smiling his way through hallways, reassuring managers that audits happen all the time, spinning the narrative that Julia was just bitter, that Marisol was just overzealous, and that everything would blow over as long as people stayed calm, which is a polite way of saying, keep quiet until I fix it behind the curtain. Richard leaned into that version too, telling Marisol to keep things low-key, to stop making noise, and when she filed a formal request to preserve records, the most basic, responsible step in any compliance matter, he responded not by thanking her but by suspending her for creating a distraction, which was both predictable and infuriating, because it revealed in one move what mattered more to him, the illusion of harmony rather than the substance of honesty. When Marisol called me afterward to tell me she had been placed on leave, I felt the familiar weight of the script our family had rehearsed for years. The favored son floats above accountability, while the women who speak inconvenient truths are quietly sidelined as problems to be managed. But instead of drowning in that script, I made a choice to pivot toward the boring, stubborn path that I knew would matter more in the long run than any argument at a party. With Priya's help, I itemized everything we could prove now: reimbursements without clear business purpose, overlapping vendor ownership, contractor roles that looked indistinguishable from employees, and what we could likely prove within a week if we got access to old ledgers, and what would require subpoena power if it came to that. Then I did something harder than confronting Evan in public. I wrote a measured, neutral email to Richard. I attached Priya's preliminary notes. I laid out what the state would almost certainly ask, and I suggested reinstating Marisol to ensure compliance was not compromised. His reply came back within an hour, a single line that sounded like every polite dismissal I had ever heard. "We will handle this internally." That sentence was less about strategy and more about the same old pattern: contain, protect, and deny until people give up. But I did not give up. I let the email sit. I resisted the temptation to fire back in anger, and instead I called my mother, Linda, and asked her directly if there was anything from the early days with Harold that I should know about. She hesitated, which told me everything, and she said she would look through some old boxes. I went to bed that night angry but clear, which is different from the kind of scattered rage that burns out fast, because clarity allows you to map the next move instead of just swinging wildly. I knew the game was tilting, not in my favor yet, but toward a point where Richard would be forced to choose between the story he wanted to believe and the facts that were already hardening into evidence. And if there was one thing my years of bookkeeping had taught me, it was that numbers, once dated and documented, do not bow to family myths. And so the stage was set for a cruel reversal, because instead of scrutinizing Evan, the man at the center of the state's questions, Richard chose to suspend Marisol, the one person inside the company who had both the title and the courage to protect him from a bigger disaster, and that choice, more than anything else, showed me how far he was willing to go to shield his golden child, even if it meant putting the company itself directly in the path of a train already gathering speed. When my mother called me and asked if I could come over because she had something I needed to see, I expected maybe a folder of old receipts or perhaps a handful of photographs that she thought might help me remember a time when the company looked cleaner and the family looked happier. But instead, she placed on the kitchen table a shoebox that smelled faintly of dust and memory, and when she opened it, what came out was not nostalgia, but a chain of letters that changed everything I thought I knew about why Evan had always been given the role of untouchable son, the golden child who could do no wrong, even when the wrong was staring everyone in the face in black and white numbers. Linda's hands shook a little as she pulled out envelopes yellowed with age, each one addressed from Harold Cole, my father's long-deceased business partner, and with them a memo that had been slipped into a Christmas card. The kind of card families send every year with cheerful fonts on the front and secrets tucked inside like time bombs waiting for someone brave enough to read them aloud. The letters spoke plainly in a way that business partners sometimes do when they trust that family bonds will keep their words from ever leaving the room, and what Harold wrote was not only about guiding the company's early growth, but also about Evan, who at that time was just starting his career, being steered into relationships that would guarantee his path forward, with vendor contracts kept in the family, a phrase that looked harmless in script, but poisonous in meaning once I realized it, was tied to the very shell vendors that the state now wanted examined. And then came the line from my mother that cracked open a truth I had not been prepared for, though some part of me must have always suspected it. Harold was not just Richard's partner in business, he was Evan's biological father. And the reason Richard had always shielded Evan with such ferocity, the reason he had treated him as if he carried some divine right to protection, was because Richard had promised Harold, before Harold died, that he would raise Evan as his own and never let the truth surface. I sat there in the kitchen, staring at the letters, and felt the ground of my life tilt because on one hand I could feel compassion for the messy adult decisions that had been made decades ago, when loyalties and love must have collided in complicated ways I will never fully understand. But on the other hand, the adult I am now knew with absolute clarity that complicated family history does not excuse misusing company funds, ignoring labor laws, or writing off luxury weekends as if they were client meetings, and so the burden shifted again onto me. I was holding the evidence that explained not just favoritism, but the financial misconduct connected to it, and if I failed to protect it properly, then once again the truth would be buried under charm, silence, and excuses. I called Priya on speaker and told her what I was looking at, and her voice, calm as ever, walked me through the steps that in moments of chaos separate people who want noise from people who want results. Scan the documents, date every page. Note exactly who touched them and when, make copies, and keep the originals stored separately where no one with a motive to destroy them can reach. She reminded me that chain of custody was everything, that regulators can forgive mistakes in interpretation, but they will not forgive sloppy handling of evidence, and so I wrote down every detail in a notebook that I dated and signed. Because as boring as that felt in the moment, I knew that years from now, it might be the only thing keeping Evan from rewriting history yet again. It was in that tense moment, trying to lighten the mood with my mother watching me write down dates and Priya lecturing me about custody, that I slipped into a mistake that, honestly, people will probably argue about forever because it was so avoidable and so silly. I said out loud, almost joking, that California doesn't have a state income tax, which of course is completely wrong, and I corrected myself within seconds. But the damage was done because once you say something confidently and it's false, no matter how small, it becomes the thing people seize on, the thing they used to say, well, if she's wrong about that, what else is she wrong about? And I could already hear, in my head, the voices of people who would rush to the comments online if this story were ever told publicly, hammering on that slip as if it mattered more than letters proving a biological connection and vendor kickbacks. But in that kitchen, with my mother's weary face staring at me, the mistake was nothing compared to the weight of the truth now sitting in our hands. Linda admitted she had kept those letters for years because some part of her knew that the day would come when silence would no longer protect anyone. And she looked at me with eyes that were tired but also fierce when she said she was finished being quiet so that the loudest men in the room could keep playing hero while women like her and like me carried the weight of their secrets. She told me to take the copies, to use them, to make sure that this time the truth was not folded away in a box for another generation to ignore. And for the first time in years, I felt not just like her daughter, but like her partner, standing on the same side of the line. I left her house with the shoebox secured, the scans already uploading to an encrypted drive Priya had set up, and a clarity that burned hotter than anything I had felt since the party. This was no longer a sibling rivalry. No longer a bitter daughter throwing accusations. This was a legal matter, a family truth, and a financial risk braided so tightly together that no amount of laughter or toasts would untangle it again. And though part of me still shook from the enormity of it, another part of me knew we were past the point of no return. The next step would not be whispers in kitchens or cautious texts between colleagues. The next step would be taking these documents into the open, into the hands of investigators who did not care about family bonds or golden children, and once that happened, nothing Richard or Evan said could stop the train already moving. And so I walked out into the night with one thought pounding in my head. The golden child's crown had always been forged in secrets, and now those secrets were finally documented, dated, and ready to be seen in the harsh light of a regulator's office. The first time you walk into a state investigator's office for something like this, you realize quickly that television has taught you nothing about how the real process unfolds, because instead of tense music, dramatic lighting, and shouting lawyers, what you get is a plain beige room, a recorder on the table, and questions read in a tone so steady and dry that it feels almost surreal to know reputations, livelihoods, and entire family legacies are being weighed in such an environment where boredom is the weapon that wears down lies. Priya and I arrived early, carrying our manila folders filled with clean copies of every document, each one numbered, dated, and summarized, because Priya had drilled into me that regulators value clarity over passion, that they would trust a simple line with a date more than any emotional speech I could ever deliver. Evan arrived later, smiling like he was walking into a business lunch instead of a hearing, shaking hands with people who did not extend theirs back, wearing that same aura of entitlement that had carried him through decades of mistakes without consequences. The investigator began with the simplest questions, walking step by step through the basics of contractor classification, asking whether the people hired through Evan's vendors provided their own tools, whether they were free to substitute replacements, whether their work was integrated into the core of the business, and whether they were managed by supervisors on site. Each answer mattered because the legal standard is not about labels, but about facts, and the more Priya explained, in her calm, precise way, the clearer it became that these so-called contractors looked and acted exactly like employees who should have received benefits, overtime protections, and payroll taxes instead of being filed under cheaper categories to keep costs off the books. When it was my turn, I laid out the reimbursements that had passed through under Evan's approvals, showing how the dates and amounts matched his personal travel logs, how entries labeled as client golf lined up perfectly with weekends that had no client meetings on the calendar, and how the same vendors that appeared in those reimbursements also tied back to Harold's holding company through property records. I did not embellish, I did not accuse, I simply presented the numbers as they stood, because I knew numbers do not cry, they do not laugh, they do not beg for understanding, they just sit there, cold and unyielding, waiting to be acknowledged. Evan leaned back in his chair, speaking in a tone designed to charm, insisting that these were industry-standard practices, that flexibility in vendor relationships is what kept the company competitive, and that Julia, he always used my name as if it were an insult, was overinterpreting coincidences. He tried to laugh off the shared landlord discovery, calling it a quirk of Ohio real estate, but the investigator's pen paused on that note longer than on anything else he said, and silence followed in a way that made even Evan's smirk falter. The moment of truth came when the investigator asked Richard whether he had been aware of Evan's connection to Harold's vendor network and whether conflict of interest disclosures had ever been filed. Richard hesitated, clearing his throat, looking at the table as if the wood grain could provide him an escape hatch, and in that hesitation, the weight of decades pressed into the room. Linda sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded tightly, watching her husband with an expression that was neither angry nor pleading, but simply resolute, as if she had already lived this moment in her mind and knew exactly how heavy it would be when it arrived. Richard finally muttered that he believed the relationships were historic and informal, which to the investigator was as good as saying no, because regulators do not care about history or informality, they care about disclosure forms and signatures. After a short break, the investigator returned with a sentence so ordinary in delivery yet so devastating in implication, "We will likely be requesting additional records and making referrals as needed." Those words, spoken without emotion, meant the case had tipped, that this was no longer a routine inquiry, but a matter that could snowball into fines, settlements, or worse if the company tried to stonewall. Back at the office, the ripple effect was immediate, even though nothing had been publicly announced. Vendors started asking questions about payment schedules, employees whispered about whether health insurance would be touched, and a bank relationship manager called Richard to check in, which was polite code for warning him that the bank had noticed the investigation and wanted reassurance before covenants were breached. In a mid-sized company, reputation is collateral, and once it frays, every relationship feels the tremor. I met Richard privately that week, knowing that the choice was closing in on him like a vice, and I told him calmly that pretending this was a misunderstanding would only make the outcome harsher, that cooperating fully, reinstating Marisol with real authority, and separating Evan from all vendor and reimbursement approvals was the only way to contain the damage. I was not asking him to abandon his son, though in some ways that was what it felt like. I was asking him to choose between a myth that had defined our family and a reality that might still allow the company to survive. Richard looked at me with eyes that seemed older than I had ever seen, eyes that carried the weight of promises made long ago to a man no longer alive, and he asked me the one question I knew was coming: will Evan go to jail? I told him honestly that from everything Priya and I understood, this case looked civil, not criminal, but that if he chose to obstruct, if he chose to falsify or destroy records, then yes, it could escalate into something far worse. And that the best protection for everyone, even Evan, was to step into the truth before the truth dragged us all by force. That night, Linda finally broke the silence she had carried for decades and said in front of Richard what she had confessed to me in the kitchen, that Evan was Harold's son, that the favoritism was never simply about talent or loyalty. that the truth had been smothered to protect reputations that were now collapsing anyway. Richard said nothing, only looked at the photo of the original shop floor, where he and Harold had once stood shoulder to shoulder, believing they were building something permanent. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of long marriage, but the silence of a man staring into a mirror that no longer softened what it showed. When I left his office that night, I knew the stakes had shifted again, because now the question was no longer whether the company would face consequences, that was certain, but whether Richard himself, the man who had built the myth of the Golden Child, would testify truthfully and allow the structure to be rebuilt, or whether he would choose one last desperate act of loyalty that would burn everything down with it. When the follow-up hearing arrived, the kind where decisions stop being theoretical and start shaping the future of a business and a family in equal measure, Richard walked in not with the bravado of the man who had built Carter Industrial Supply from the ground up, nor with the jovial air of the retiree who had basked in applause at his party, but with the weary steadiness of someone who had finally realized that denial was more exhausting than the truth, and that protecting one's sons' illusions at the cost of everything else was no longer a burden he could carry without destroying himself as well. He began with an apology that was unpolished and halting, yet all the more real for its lack of rehearsal, admitting to the investigator and to those of us in the room that he had failed to enforce conflict disclosures, that he had allowed family entanglements to dictate business decisions, and that, while he could not undo decades of favoritism, he could commit to clean governance from this point forward, even if it meant humiliating his golden child and relinquishing the story he had held onto for so long. The measures he accepted were not symbolic gestures, but concrete steps that shifted the power structure overnight. Marisol was reinstated not only with her title, but with expanded authority to implement compliance protocols. Priya was retained as an independent review consultant to oversee every vendor contract and reimbursement system for the next 2 years, and Evan was formally removed from all vendor approvals and expense sign-offs, his role stripped down to a probationary project assignment that carried salary but no decision-making power. Richard's cooperation meant the company agreed to pay back wages to misclassified workers, to standardize contractor vetting, and to adopt mandatory conflict disclosures that would be audited quarterly, and while the financial cost was real, settlements and compliance upgrades ate into reserves that had been intended as part of Richard's retirement cushion. It was survivable, and more importantly, it created the possibility of a future not built on whispered lies and paperwork games. Evan, predictably, responded with indignation, calling the restrictions unfair, insisting that everyone was exaggerating, and reminding us that revenue numbers under his watch had been strong, as if that erased the misconduct tied to those revenues. But for the first time in my memory, Richard did not echo his defense, did not soften his words, and did not turn the conversation into a plea for harmony. He simply told Evan that being family does not erase accountability, and that protecting him in the past had nearly cost them everything, a sentence that landed with more force than any reprimand Evan had ever heard, because it came from the one man who had always shielded him. What surprised me most in the weeks that followed was not Evan's sulking withdrawal or the ripple of relief through the office once Marisol returned, but the quiet way hidden strengths began to rise once the shadow of favoritism lifted. Tasha, a warehouse lead who had never been considered management material because she lacked a degree, created a simple system on her phone to track approval chains that impressed even Priya with its practicality, and within a month, that system became the backbone of a new compliance log. A vendor who had been sidelined years earlier for refusing to play by Evan's flexible rules returned with a stronger contract because, as they told me bluntly, they trusted a company led by people who respected policies more than charisma, and Linda, my mother, who had spent decades keeping secrets so that louder men could protect myths, began speaking in meetings with a confidence I had never seen, reminding Richard openly that a legacy is not the plaque on the wall or the banquet speech, but the day-to-day sense of safety and honesty felt by the people who keep the lights on. For me, the victory did not come with confetti or even satisfaction, because by the time you drag a truth into daylight, there is little joy left, only the relief of knowing that you are no longer complicit in silence. And what mattered more was the small but undeniable shift in how people treated me. Colleagues who once looked at me as the bitter daughter now came to me for guidance on processes. Richard asked me to sit in on strategy meetings, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity, and even the bank relationship manager, who had once sounded cautious, now called to say he was reassured by the structural changes, which in the world of finance is as close to a blessing as you will ever get. Evan's future remained uncertain, suspended between his own unwillingness to accept limits and the company's decision to no longer indulge him, and perhaps that was justice in itself, because consequences are not always exile or prison. Sometimes they are the harder reality of living in a world that no longer bends to your comfort, and in that sense, his punishment was not being cast out, but being forced to exist inside rules he had always evaded. Richard, for his part, looked diminished and freer at the same time, like a man who had set down a burden that had bent his back for decades, and in our last private conversation, he admitted quietly that he had enjoyed the role of protector too much, that it had fed his pride to be the man who could fix everything for his son, even when the fixing meant bending reality, and that letting go now was the first honest thing he had done for the company in years. I did not lecture him, did not demand more apologies, because I knew the moment was fragile and what mattered most was not words but follow-through, and so I simply thanked him for choosing the company, the employees, and, in a way, me, over the myth of the golden child, a choice that could never erase the past, but could at least set the ground for a different future. I left his office with no dramatic gesture, just a copy of the new compliance handbook in my bag, and a sense that for the first time in years, the family business was standing on rules instead of favoritism. And if you ask me whether this ending felt like triumph, I would say it felt more like balance, the kind of balance that comes after years of walking tilted, because emotional justice is rarely loud, it is often quiet, showing up in small details like a warehouse lead's phone app, a reinstated HR director writing the clearest handbook the company had ever seen, or a mother finally speaking without fear of shattering a story that never should have been told. The golden child still sat at family dinners, the father still carried his memories of promises to Harold, and I still carried the scars of being overlooked, but now, at least, the lies had been stripped bare, the company had survived. And I had learned that sometimes victory is not about winning applause, but about building a clean line that will not collapse the moment someone looks too closely. And so the story closed not with certainty, but with an unanswered question that still lingers in the silence after every meeting and every meal. When truth and loyalty clash, when protecting family means betraying integrity, what does love really choose? And how do you live with the cost once the choice is made?